Are you using a deep heat projector in your reptile's enclosure? What about ceramic heat emitters or radiant heat panels? Are you using any of those as your primary heat source? If you are, you're going to want to watch this. I'll tell you why I threw all of my deep heat projectors in the trash, why I think you should do the same, and I'll break down the science and the ideal methods and tools you should be using for heating and lighting in your enclosures so you can optimize the health and welfare of your scaly friends. It might also save you money on energy costs. Let's slither on into it. One of the more challenging and confounding things about caring for reptiles is keeping up with the most current evidence-based information about how to give them their best lives and keep them healthy. There are so many opinions and products to choose from, and things are evolving all the time. So it definitely keeps you on your toes and requires you to be flexible and open to changing your ways when more advanced methods and tools become available. But as many options, opinions, and products as there are to choose from, science is our best mentor. And what science taught me recently is that the way I had my heat and light set up in my enclosures was not as optimal as I thought it was. I actually shared a bunch of this in a live stream presentation a few months ago, but I realized that lives are not always as appealing or easy to watch for some folks, so I figured it'd be worth making an episode about it to make it even easier to digest. Now keep in mind, I'm going to be simplifying some pretty complex concepts here. It took some time and work to understand this myself, but I think I've managed to boil things down in a way that makes it clear, and more importantly, easy to put into practical use. I'll put some references in the description below to where I got my information, but the primary source is from the lead researcher and expert on the subject, Thomas Griffiths of Damascus Limited, who not only consults for zoos, vets, and hobbyists, but tests and reviews and even helps to develop many of the products we use internationally in herpetoculture. Most of us already know that as ectotherms, reptiles require a gradient of heat in order to regulate their body temperatures, facilitate digestion, and fuel various other biological processes. But it wasn't until recently that I really understood that the type of heat we provide matters. Not all sources of infrared radiation are equally beneficial, and that heat alone doesn't provide all that our reptiles need in order to thrive. Ideally, we want to give them as close to what they'd have in the wild as we can, right? Of course, we have to acknowledge that we'll never be able to recreate nature perfectly in an enclosure. It's just not possible with the technology we have available or in such a small space. But we want to get as close of an approximation to nature as we can. And in order to do that, we need to understand what it is they would naturally be exposed to and how that relates to the husbandry tools at our disposal. So at bare minimum, we want to provide our reptiles with UVB and a heat lamp, such as a halogen or an incandescent bulb, that provides both heat and visible light during the daytime, even for nocturnal species. Unfortunately, a lot of reptile caretakers aren't even providing that bare minimum because what's often recommended is even less than that. But here on Snake Therapy, the goal is always to go beyond the minimum. So if we want to do that and increase our welfare, we need to provide a full spectrum of electromagnetic wavelengths, which includes 2 different types of infrared, UVB, and a full spectrum of visible light. So let's break that down. In your enclosure, you'll need a UVB lamp of appropriate output and wattage, a heat lamp like a halogen or incandescent bulb, full spectrum LEDs, a gradient of all of the above throughout the enclosure that gives them the ability to choose their exposure levels, and a natural photoperiod that shifts appropriately over a 24-hour period. So where do your deep heat projectors, ceramic heat emitters, and radiant heat panels come into that equation? I'll get to that. But let's break this heat and light stuff down a little bit more first. Heat and light are both made up of electromagnetic wavelengths. Longer wavelengths are infrared radiation, which is perceived as heat. Shorter wavelengths cause color and brightness in our eyes, aka light. A heat lamp, or bulb as we Americans call them, emits certain types of wavelengths when applied with energy. And the more energy applied to any object, such as the filament in that lamp, the hotter it gets. And the hotter it gets, the more it glows, therefore creating both heat and light. In nature, reptiles are getting both of these things, and this is important even for nocturnal animals. Just like how the sun rising kicks our circadian rhythms into gear for our waking period, the sun going down does the same for nocturnal animals, and they'll even occasionally bask in the sunlight, either out in the open or cryptically. That's why it's crucial that we don't just provide infrared, but the full spectrum of electromagnetic wavelengths and a photoperiod for both diurnal and nocturnal animals. Another crucial thing to acknowledge here is that UVB and the infrared wavelengths from your heat lamps don't just help your animal thermoregulate, digest, and process vitamin D, they also help strengthen their immune system and kill bacteria. That's why it's so important to provide these things efficiently and effectively in our enclosures. But in terms of heat, there are also different types of infrared wavelengths, and the heating tools we have do not provide equal amounts of those. So let's dive a bit deeper into infrared to understand why that matters. The sun, which is obviously the perfect light and heat source, is 5,500 degrees Celsius or about 9,932 degrees Fahrenheit. Cut that in half, you get the filament in a heat lamp, such as a halogen. The filament in a deep heat projector, though, it's over 4 times less than that. That means that even a 100-watt deep heat projector is still not as hot as a 25-watt halogen bulb. That one kind of blew my mind a bit personally. But it makes sense. A DHP has a very faint glow, right? Remember earlier I said that the hotter something gets, the more it glows. So if a 25-watt halogen is brighter than a DHP, then it's got to be hotter than a DHP. I used to think that it was a good idea to put a heat bulb on a dimmer, dial it down, and pair it with a deep heat projector or a ceramic heat emitter to get my warm temperatures where they needed to be. I was wrong. Ideally, you don't need that DHP or CHE at all. You want to try and provide your infrared via the wavelengths that come from your halogen or basking bulb. Dimming your heat lamp reduces its temperature by shortening its wavelengths and shifts the visible light spectrum it puts out, which reduces its effectiveness. So you want to figure out what wattage heat bulb is appropriate for your enclosure and use it at full strength. If it's too hot, get a lower wattage bulb, but use it at full power. Which brings us back around to the reason we shouldn't use deep heat projectors as our primary heat source for our reptiles. Because DHPs are basically a highly dimmed heat lamp, which, as we just said, isn't as effective as a basking bulb at full power. You get more bang for your buck out of your 25-watt halogen than you do from your 75-watt DHP, because the filament in that DHP emits a longer wavelength and doesn't emit visible light. But here's some reasons not to use DHPs at all. The sun emits infrared A and C, so obviously those are the wavelengths we want because the sun is the heat source that we're trying to replicate. The filament in a heat lamp emits infrared A, B, and C. Infrared B isn't really found in nature at all, but it's giving off A and C in approximation of the sun, so that's good. However, the filament in a deep heat projector emits infrared B and C, with maybe 2% of A. So that means that it's projecting primarily unnatural and inefficient wavelengths. On top of that, it's a very focused beam of radiation, which isn't just unnatural, it's not helpful for warming the ambient temperatures in your enclosure. I mean, at this point, most of us have come to understand that things like heat mats aren't sufficient heat sources for our reptiles because they're only providing heat to a part of our animal's body instead of warming the ambient temperature, giving their enclosures that thermal gradient we want. So a DHP isn't doing that efficiently. But on top of all of this, deep heat projectors are, well, a lie. The name of the product and the description on the box says it provides infrared wavelengths that penetrate deeply into the tissue of your animal. But guess what? The peak wavelength to penetrate into tissue is about 1100 nanometers, which is what a 25-watt incandescent lamp gives off. But a DHP it emits less than a fraction of a percent of that. So it's unnatural, inefficient, and it's not even doing what it says it's supposed to do. That's why I threw all of mine in the trash. So now that we're tossing those DHPs, let's walk through how to choose a heat lamp. There are a lot of different types of bulbs to choose from, so you need to understand the differences between them to make an informed decision about which one is best for your situation. A halogen provides a wide spread of radiation, so it will heat and light a larger area of your enclosure. That's great if you have a larger animal and/or a larger enclosure to warm up. A bulged reflector, or BR bulb, will have a bit of a softer focus of radiation. So if the halogen is getting your whole enclosure too warm, you could switch to one of these so you could have a better gradient of temps across your enclosure. I use halogens or BR bulbs depending on the animal, enclosure, and the situation. You can also put two lower wattage bulbs right next to each other in order to broaden the span of the radiation without making it too hot. This can also allow larger animals to get their entire bodies exposed to the heat at once, which is what we want, because in nature, they'd be able to do that if they wanted to. You really just have to try things out and see what works, because it's not exactly a plug-and-play situation. No pun intended. The size of the enclosure, the materials it's made of, the species of your reptile, and the ambient temperatures in your home, they're all going to be a factor in what works best for you. And keep in mind that UVB lamps and LEDs do give off some heat as well, so when you're combining those things with your heat lamp, it's really important to test things out for a while to ensure that you get it right. I regularly play around with my heat lamps to suit my animals' needs, and I also have some of my heat lamps or UVBs on timers so that they turn off for periods during the day to create a more randomized gradient and to keep it from getting too hot for too long. If you think about it, being blasted with exactly the same amount of light and heat every single day, all day long, doesn't really make sense. Clouds cover the sun sometimes. Temperatures vary across seasons. Nature is not consistent. For your reptile, the most important thing is that it gets exposure to the appropriate gradient of temperatures regularly, but it doesn't have to be an exact degree 24/7, 365 days a year. There are some other options for heat lamps you could try. Just make sure you do your testing before you expose your reptile to them. For example, metal halide bulbs seem great because they provide UVB and UV1, which is what supports reptile eyesight. However, they get very hot. Likewise, mercury vapor bulbs have a high output of UV, and they also get very hot. So for most species of captive snakes, those options aren't going to be appropriate. But wait, what if your halogen or BR bulbs aren't getting hot enough? That's where your supplemental heating comes in. So if needed, you could use things like a ceramic heat emitter or a radiant heat panel to boost the ambient temperature in your enclosure. Why are those better than deep heat projectors? Because they emit infrared C, which is the wavelength that naturally comes from the sun and is also the type of infrared that, say, a rock that's been sitting in the sun would give off. But if your CHEs or RHPs are your only source of heat, then you're missing that infrared A. That's why they should be used as supplemental heat as opposed to your primary heat source. But what about at night? I can't run my light bulbs all night. No, you can't, and that's okay. In fact, if you can, you should turn off all your overhead heat at night. When the sun goes down and there's no more giant ball of fire in the sky, there's no more heat coming from above, and temperatures drop. Night drops are totally natural for your reptile and can actually be beneficial for regulating their metabolism, as long as they're not too extreme. The problem with most reptile care guides is that they usually tell you what your hottest temp and your coolest temp should be and leave it at that, as if your animal should have both those temperatures at all times. But that just doesn't make sense, because if our goal is to try to replicate a natural environment, then not only is there a gradient during the daytime, there's a gradient from day through the night. There are very few places on Earth where the temperature remains exactly the same for 24 hours a day. So that hot temp in your care guide is talking about the basking temperature during the day, the approximate warmest ambient temperature the species would be exposed to in their natural environment during the daytime. And often that's not taking into account that surface temperatures of things like rock or sand could exceed those temps. So as long as your animal has the space and opportunity to get away from the heat, then exact numbers are not quite as crucial to focus on. But I digress. Right now, we're talking about ambient nighttime temperatures. So to make sure that your reptile doesn't get too cold at night, you'll want to do a few things. 1, do research into its native habitat and find weather data for those areas to figure out what your nighttime highs and lows should be. And 2, know what the high and low ambient temperatures of your reptile room are at night. Then you can decide if you need a heat source at night or if it's not necessary at all. If it is necessary, what are some good options for nighttime heating? Well, for one, you could simply warm up the room by turning on the thermostat or using a space heater. Another method is to place your basking lamp over some kind of rock or slate that will absorb and retain some of the heat during the day and continue to emit infrared C for a while after the lights go out. But if the ambient temperature in your home really does get too cold at night, then a radiant heat panel or ceramic heat emitter will be your best options. And if you're going to do that, then I would recommend that you put those on a timer that's set to go on after your basking lamps go out and on a thermostat set to a lower temperature than your daytime basking temperature. Because remember, it's really never going to be that hot during the night in nature, so you just want to warm it up a section of the enclosure a bit higher than the natural nighttime warm temp that you got from your weather data research. A couple other options are sky hides, which can trap warm air from the daytime, creating a cozy little warm spot for your animal to visit during the evening. Or you could use closed top or thick PVC enclosures like these Apex enclosures that retain heat better than glass or thinner materials. Or, and there's a caveat with this one, you could cover part of your screen top. But please don't do this unless your enclosure has plenty of other ventilation. Airflow is a crucial part of maintaining a healthy environment in your little enclosure ecosystem. Improper ventilation can lead to a whole host of issues that could seriously harm your reptile's health. Let's go back to our lighting and photoperiod, because how you arrange these tools does actually matter. I didn't realize I was doing things wrong myself until pretty recently, so here's what I learned. Your goal should be to cluster your lighting and heating elements together as much as you can, because you want your reptile to absorb all of the electromagnetic wavelengths you're providing with your various bulbs over their entire body at once if they so choose. In herpetoculture, this is called zoning. Just think about it. When they go into the sun, they're not just getting UVB, right? They're getting all of it. UVB, infrared, the whole gamut of electromagnetic wavelengths. To quote Arcadia's website, in this way, the animal can utilize the energy naturally, self-regulating its own exposure as needed. We then separate the warmer basking area from the cooler, more humid end of the enclosure. Zoning is vital to the correct supply of recreated terrestrial light. This will allow an animal to self-select its own level of exposure within its own biological cycles, from controlled heat and full spectrum light to cool and shade, just as it would in the wild. To increase the options for your animal, you can provide cover and hides in the basking zone, which allows your animal to get both full exposure or to bask cryptically, exposing just a portion of its body while keeping the rest of it hidden and safe. Our goal with creating a photoperiod is to imitate nature and support circadian rhythms, and therefore we want our heat and light to come on in the order it would appear in the wild. That means infrared first, then visible light, then UVB. And this would normally happen over a span of about 30 minutes. In practical terms, and with the tools we're using, that would mean that for sunrise, your heat lamps go on first, that's your halogen or your BR bulb, then your LEDs, warm first and cool second if you can separate, and lastly, your UVB lamp. In the evening, all this goes off in the reverse order. Your UVB goes off first, then your cool LEDs, then your heat lamps last. Here's where things like smart power strips really come in handy. I use the Casa brand, but there are others. It's just a power strip that allows you to control each plug individually. All of this is a lot to process, but it really does make a difference. Since altering the types and arrangements of my heating and lighting, my snake's behaviors have noticeably changed, and this happened immediately. When I put my Japanese rat snake in this 4x2x2 enclosure, knowing that she didn't need a lot of heat and preferred cool temperatures, I set it up with a DHP shoved in the back corner, a small UVB kind of centered on the warm side, and then 2 cool LEDs spread out over the whole thing. But this meant that when she wanted to bask under her UVB, she wasn't getting full exposure to infrared, nor to her visible light, and that visible light was only one part of the spectrum. So when I made my changes, I removed the DHP and replaced it with a 25-watt BR bulb, and moved the fixture further in and over a ledge that had some rocks on it. Then I switched her UVB to a more appropriate size and wattage, and put that right next to the basking bulb. I then added some warm LEDs and moved them all around so that the warm and cool were positioned right next to each other and the UVB, and then put a small LED on the cool side simply to light that side of the enclosure a little bit. Note that she has a hide on the basking shelf so she can bask openly or cryptically, and the shelf and the rocks there would help retain some heat into the evening. All these things span enough area that she could bask on the floor of the enclosure too, offering her the option to also bask under all the elements with a little less intense level of exposure. There's still plenty of cover for security, so she's got lots of options. As soon as I made these changes, she came out and went right to that basking shelf. I'd never really seen her bask under her DHP, but once I made these changes, she started coming out regularly to bask on that ledge in the morning, then moving to the floor, then to the branch, then moving away to the cool side later in the day. This behavior continued consistently, so I am 100% sure that I have done the right thing. Something to note is that I spent the day monitoring the new setup pretty constantly after I installed it because she was already in there. After a couple hours, I noticed that it was getting a few degrees hotter under that basking bulb than what her supposed highest temperature should be, according to the care guides anyway. But when I looked at climate data, I noticed that it does get hotter than that recommended temperature in Japan. But more importantly, I spent time observing her response. And what her behavior told me was that that higher temperature was just fine. She was basking at 89 degrees, happy as a clam, and I know she was happy because relative to her size, she has a huge enclosure with tons of opportunity to get away from that heat, but she didn't until she was ready to. Because she has the amount of space and gradient that she does, I trust her to thermoregulate as she needs to on her own. On the flip side, if your enclosure forces your animal to be either super hot or super cold, that's a problem. If you don't have enough hides and cover to allow them to feel safe enough to use their whole gradient, then they may choose an option that's detrimental to them. Reptiles will invariably choose security and safety over regulating their body temperature. So if you don't ensure they feel safe at all times, they may choose to overheat or stay too cold in order to remain secure. So when you're working this stuff out for your animal, the best plan of attack is to make sure you have as many options for them to feel safe in all of your zones so they will do what's best for them at the time that's best for them. Observe their response to what you give them and adapt if they don't seem to be utilizing it. They're all individuals after all, so what's good for one may not be what's good for another, even within the same species. And the more space you give them, the more gradients you're able to provide. When Elora was in her 2-foot enclosure, I really struggled to get her cool temps cool enough because there just wasn't enough space away from the heat source to allow her that cool down that she liked. If you're used to using dimming or on-off thermostats with your heating elements, you might wonder whether you should use them with your basking bulbs. You can use on-off thermostats, but not in the way that you're used to with CHEs and RHPs. You don't want your halogens flickering on and off constantly throughout the day, and you definitely don't want them dimming either, for the reasons we reviewed earlier. I know that some people use their Herpstats with their basking bulbs, although I personally cannot speak from experience with those. I'd assume you want to set the thermostat's high temperature to hotter than your hotspot should get to ensure it doesn't turn off during the day, and simply use it as a safety precaution or as your timer or ramp up and down for your sunrise and sunset. I don't currently use thermostats with my basking bulbs, but I also work from home, so I'm peeking at all of my enclosures regularly throughout the day, and I feel confident I would catch any issues before they become a danger. At very least, there are thermometers that have alarms to let you know if the temperatures exceed safety. Again, I need to emphasize your responsibility to test your heat lamps for an extended period before you trust that they're the correct wattage and placement, and to pay attention to the behavior of your animal in response to what you offer. If they don't display natural, healthy behaviors, you should adapt accordingly. Also, don't forget to recheck your temperatures as the seasons change in case you need to switch your bulbs out for stronger or lower wattages based on shifting ambient temperatures in your home. Lastly, make sure you know what Ferguson zone your reptile is in and get yourself a solar meter to verify your UVB output is at the correct levels for your species. You can pretty easily find out the Ferguson zone of your reptile with a Google search or on the Arcadia Luminize website. Solar meters are expensive tools, but in the long run, you'll not only have peace of mind, but you can actually save some money. UVB lamps often say they need to be replaced every 6 to 12 months, but if you use your solar meter to check the bulb at a year and it's still putting out the right amount of UVB, then you don't need to replace it yet. Look, no matter what anyone says, if you're doing herpetoculture right, it's not a cheap hobby. But every penny you spend on quality tools is a dollar saved in vet bills, and more importantly, time added onto their lifespan. And I'd say the latter is pretty priceless. I personally struggled to grasp these concepts for a while. It took me breaking it down into bite-sized, practical pieces to get it to really click. So I hope that my extremely simplified version of these things made it easier for you to possibly improve the welfare of your animals. Mad respect and gratitude to Damascus and Adam from the Expert and the Idiot podcast, who facilitated a conversation that helped me finally get it. To JTB Reptiles, whose channel has some fantastic peer-reviewed research and explanations on the subject. And especially to Roy Arthur Blodgett of Wellspring Herpetoculture and the Project Herpetoculture podcast, who's been an amazing ally, friend, and support system for my own personal journey of increasing my care. He's also giving some webinars on this topic in the coming months, so definitely check out those on the Happy Dragons channel. He'll inevitably do a much better job at explaining this stuff than I did, but I had to at least try. Please do me a huge favor and like the video before you go, drop a comment, share it, and if you want to receive a PDF version of my visual presentation on the subject and support the channel at the same time, please head over to Patreon to become a supporting member. I'm Shira, and this is Galadriel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time for more snake therapy.